Is this our second year?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. On behalf of the Conference Organizing Committee, as Carrie, Jessica, Joe, Ansel, and Massey, I welcome you to the third of the 4-day Location Intelligence Knowledge Exchange, Mother Earth Edition. I'm Arthur Beryl, Distinguished Technologist at RBC. You may, some of our guests today are aware of the original Light Conference. This is the second of the series, and we've chosen to theme this around climate change. Today's version, we're very privileged to have three speakers who are in the technology part of the conference. So I invite you to listen to what they have to say. Before we start with our keynote speaker, there's a few items that I should cover. So you may know this from the platform already, but in the top right-hand corner of the let me just get rid of this. In the top right-hand corner of the screen, you should see a question and answer section. So please post your questions there, or discussions or arguments or whatever. And when we get to the end of the session, I'll pick those off for Jan to have a look at. There's also a down arrow in the same place that will move the sidebar for you so you can get a bit more screen real estate. And there's a button in the top right-hand part of the speaker section, of the main section, that looks like 4 little arrows going in. If you hit that, you'll get a full screen version of the presentation. Also, there are virtual booths, which we'd love for you to go visit. The booths are open right now. And there are also tables. So if you decide you want to have a conversation with one of the speakers or with somebody else in the audience, then you can just go use one of those tables. They're obviously virtual tables. I would be remiss if I didn't recognize the folks who've helped make this possible, contributions to our Platinum platform, and that was Microsoft. And we have two gold sponsors, Cato and RBC. And Cato has a booth you should go visit. So thank you very much to the sponsors. Now, the first of our stellar cast of speakers is a friend of mine, Jan Kestle. And I have a little bit of a story here to read you. Jan has been leader in the data business in Canada for many decades. She's an expert in using statistics and information to solve business and social problems. A mathematician by training, Jan discovered a long time ago that geography is the secret ingredient in developing and using data that makes people's lives better. From the early days of geodemography in the 80s to the current fascination with location intelligence, Jan has been passionate about the importance of adding location to databases and spatial analytics to data science. As businesses turn to developing and implementing policies related to ESG, Jan and Environics Analytics are leveraging existing sources to help organizations understand, what their users expect from them, and at the same time exploring new data sources to help us all achieve our goals with respect to climate change, social justice, and ethical corporate governance. Jan also sits on several boards, and in fact, Jan and I have worked side by side on some university advisory boards. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jan and retreat into the background.
Thanks, Arthur. I'm just going to pull up my file here. And while I'm doing that, I just want to say how delighted I am to participate one more time in this conference. We've had a couple of virtual sessions already. We had live conference, I guess, in the first time out. And it's so exciting to talk about how location intelligence really has impacts on so many things we do. I want to salute the other sponsors and partners in putting this together and putting together such a varied and informed set of speakers. I think what's really exciting about it is to really talk about location intelligence in the context of the important issue of climate change, and the perspective that we're taking here today is environment, social, and social justice and governance. What what's true for me in almost every aspect of society is how important data are in really making sure that people rely on data-driven decision making. And I used to say, when we kind of started using that phrase and talking about it 7 or 8 years ago, I used to say, well, what the heck else would you make your decisions on? But trust me, having worked with so many organizations, I know that sometimes there's a lot of gut feel and sometimes there's an attempt to use data. But what really seems to be happening is that organizations are investing more in data, and they're investing in tools, and they're investing in talent. But what we really need to be sure of is that we're using the right data and the right methodologies to answer the business and social problems we're trying to solve. And so Environics Analytics, which I founded, I would say now almost 20 years ago, is really based on the assumption that data can make people's lives better. And when we say that, people often think we're talking about, how we plan cities and how we support healthcare and social services. But I also think in some of the business applications in terms of marketing and engagement and delivering products and services to individuals and to consumers. With people's busy lives and all the choices and complexity that we have in media, that the more we can use data to make sure that not only social services and government services, but that all aspects of what we deliver as business people, it's really important to use data in order to respect the time of individuals and in order to really help them make their lives better and easier. And as the world gets more complex, it's really important that we embrace the use of data. And so I always, when I speak to groups of people, especially a session like this, which is about technology and data, I always try to remind the geeks within us that it's extremely important to stand for truth and fact and data-driven decision making in everything that we do. And that's been our mission, as I said, for a number of years. When it comes to thinking about the questions that are driven by location intelligence, as Arthur said in the introduction, I'm not a geographer by training, but more than 30 years ago, I started to work with how geography becomes the secret sauce in integrating disparate data, how we can look at so many things that are happening in the world by really understanding what happens where and when. And so when we move to talking about things like climate change and other how individuals feel about social justice and the main drivers that have an impact on really how we make Canada and the world a better place, and how brands and organizations connect with individuals, citizens, and consumers, I think it's important to highlight the fact that location intelligence is a really important part of using data to form our policies, to implement programs, and to really help make Canada more competitive, Canada to be the kind of country that it's been traditionally in terms of being an organization that has strong support for social justice and equality. While we still have challenges, that data can really help us overcome these challenges. My belief is that you really can't change if you don't measure. And so even though there are many measurements around the environment, around social justice and good governance, that where we really don't have good data, my belief is that we have to start and we have to understand that even though we're never going to have all the data gaps filled and have everything that we need be perfect, that we have to move forward and measure progress and set benchmarks for ourselves as businesses and government organizations. And if you want to be a part of a movement for progress, and particularly in times like these, when hopefully we're coming out of a pandemic and people are really burdened by things that are happening in the world, that we can help use data for good and help data really make Canada and the world a better place. So, I'm going to show you a few examples of how we think that the data that already exists can be tortured to give us some insights, how we can use data to really make sure that we're thinking about the environment, social justice, and governance programs. And I know the focus is on climate change, but what I wanted to talk about was sort of to collide that with the focus that's really happening right now, where brands are, past the area of corporate social responsibility and are really attempting to understand how they can connect with their customers and the people they serve around who we really are as businesses and how we can help make sure that we're keeping our brand values consistent with the values that the people that we do business with expect. So, when we think from the kind of data that we have access to, we think about environmental issues that relate to climate change and just generally concern for the environment, social issues around diversity and inclusion, obviously, but also human rights and philanthropy, and governance around, obviously, good corporate governance and making sure that things are done not only in a compliant way, but in a way that's really consistent with our country's kind of goals and values, and also to make sure that ethics are observed in the kind of work that we do as businesses. So we try to look for data that can help organizations orient themselves and their programs and measure and also communicate to their customers and their users and the people that they serve where they stand on those issues. And I just threw my mouse off the table, so I apologize for that. Hopefully it still works. And what I want to talk to you about today is how data can help us better understand and quantify ESG. If you're familiar with Environics Analytics, we work from a set of commercial off-the-shelf segments. It's not the only thing we do. We work with custom segments and we work with demographics and we work with many other variables. But at the cornerstone of a lot of what we do is a system that we call PRISM. You're probably familiar with these kinds of systems. Every 5 years, we take a large amount of data. I remember just going back 35 years ago, you used to take census data and you used to let a program run for 4 weeks on a timeshare computer that you were sharing with the university, and then you had a system that you used for after one run, you used it for a decade. Well, now we have the opportunity to take all the data that we have about what people do and their demographics and all kinds of things, and really create a schema for neighborhoods so that we can maximize the similarity within groups of people, and we can also maximize the differences of groups of people. And I'm not going to give a lecture on that kind of statistical process and how it's evolved. But one of the great things is that now that the technology is so advanced and there's so much data that can be used, it's important to create, for the purposes that I'm going to describe, that we have the best possible classification of neighborhoods and postal codes. Because what we're doing is we're letting a postal code in a privacy compliant way stand in for what we expect the behavior of individuals to be. And although many organizations have a lot of detailed information that their users and their customers give to them, they don't always have the whole picture. If you're a bank, you would know a lot of financial information. If you're offering social services, you may know a lot about the family and that kind of situation. But for decades, we've used these kind of systems to fill out the picture, to understand who different groups of people are and how I can really engage and ensure that I'm offering products and services that I'm targeting and I'm retaining and I'm servicing and I'm delighting the customers and my users by knowing as much as I can about them. So when we take all this data and we go through a process to mash it all up and create a categorization. We let the data speak, and we create a system, and we create it every 5 years, but we update the counts and assignments every year. We look at maps. We look at very exhaustive review of different kinds of outputs. And as I mentioned, we did the first one, and it took 3 weeks of running, and we said, okay, that looks good. And now when we build a system like this, we actually allow the technology to give us 100 or 200 options overnight, and then the next morning we say, well, this one looks pretty good, well, let's tweak this and let's tweak that. So the power of data to really let the data tell the story and help people make decisions based on fact rather than gut, and stand up for what we're trying to stand up for in many aspects of life, which is truth. It's never been more possible or more exciting to be able to really use data to help people understand what's going on in the world. And so we start with PRISM, 67 segments, uniquely assigned to 750 to 800,000 postal codes, so covering the whole country. And the reason why that's important is because it then enables us to look at a lot of different activities and populations through a standard schema. Many of our customers wouldn't look at 67 different segments, but they might look at groups of segments based on their own data. And you can look at things like this. Now, this is a very simple way of looking at data, but boy, it tells me a story. What we've done is we've associated with each one of those 67 segments what the psychographic index is around certain mindsets or value trends. We have a system called Social Values, which was developed by our former sister company and still longtime partner, Environics Research, that asks a battery of questions every year to a large sample of Canadians and works through a proprietary method to say people hold these different kinds of values. It's different than behaviors. It's actually getting at what are the mental postures and what are the mindsets of different kinds of Canadians. And there are lots of studies and books, most famous, Michael Adams, the pioneer in this space, who was my former business partner, wrote a book first called Sex in the Snow, The Values of Canadians, and then Fire and Ice, The Values of Canadians and Americans, and really teasing out what people's mental postures are based on this detailed research method. What we did was we incorporated that into how we created our PRISM segments. And then we also, after the fact, every year, link the values and attitudes that the PRISM segments are likely to hold. On this chart, we've plotted the index against all of Canada for each segment for two values that I thought were of interest to the group today. One is multiculturalism, and the other is ecological concern. So the one thing that I'm, excited, and I went back to say, did you guys actually fake this up? But it's amazing to me how well distributed the 67 lifestyle types from across Canada fit into the 4 quadrants. And you could look right in at those 67 different lifestyle types that capture socioeconomic status. They capture urban versus rural, Quebec segments, different cultural segments. So many aspects of life are encapsulated in how these segments are defined. But when we look at the values, there are segments that, rank low, both on the importance to them of multiculturalism and ecological concern. There's some that are high on multiculturalism that are, not above average on ecological concern. And so if you were a brand that was really trying to position how you wanted to design your strategy and really convince people about what you were doing on climate change, then you would look at that top left quadrant and say, how could I, if these people are, well represented in the groups that I'm serving, either as customers or, residents in my community, you would look at where the opportunities are for the groups that hold, both of the values highly, or where there's the opportunity to use data to really decide on your messaging and your stance on how you're going to influence people's belief systems. Because I believe that thinking about the ESG programs, of course, we are trying to take a stand and do the right thing for our brands. But I also think, being in the business for a long time and really dealing with large numbers of people, that we're really in an era where it's not just going to be lip service. People really do care about social justice. We've seen that in the past 2 years. We've seen, obviously, the key focus on the climate and climate change. And I don't think this is a phase that's going to pass. So I think it's a good news story that in order to be successful in business and in serving the communities, that we really have to take a stand as organizations on where we stand on these issues. And we have to understand that it's complex, and that across the groups that we're serving, there's going to be a lot of difference. And I think these data can be very helpful in doing that. Just to give you a little bit more texture on what our social values studies show us, ecological concern is a tendency to believe that today's environmental problems are a result of industrial and personal disregard for the environment. In other words, we can actually do something about it. People strong on this construct feel that environmental destruction is unacceptable, and they reject the notion that job protection or economic advancement should be allowed at the expense of environmental protection. They also reject the idea that any one person is too small to contribute to this project. So if you were going to really want to influence groups of people that you interact with, you could see these people would be very receptive to the right kind of message. Similarly, multiculturalism, the openness towards diverse cultures, ethnic communities, and immigrants that make up Canada, a belief that ethnic groups should be encouraged to preserve their cultural identities and that others should seek to learn about them. And then finally, governance. We chose the variable ethical consumerism, the willingness to base consumer decisions on the perceived ethics of a company that's making the product, and whether management treats employees fairly, cooperates with governments that do not meet ethical standards, or uses testing methods that involve mistreatment of animals. So you can see that although there's not 100% alignment with all the goals and objectives of some of these programs, that getting at the nuance of this data can really help us understand how we can further our own goals. If you're familiar with a system like PRISM, we often take all the different segments, and then we look at whether segments are to the right or to the left of the line, showing the groups of segments that are over or underrepresented in terms of a particular behavior. And in this case, I'm doing it in terms of a belief system. So just a short course, the red are urban segments, the orange are suburban. You can see there's some rural segments, there's some elements that are more located in Quebec, but really looking at a quick look, and a statistical study would go much further, but you understand, and they're ranked socioeconomically. So you can see this environmental, social, and governance. Different groups of people have a real affinity or a strongly held belief at different rates around these different aspects of ESG programs. Taking a little further look, if we just tease out some of the segments, you can see that younger urban segments tend to be eco-friendly and socially conscious groups that prioritize environmental protection and ecological lifestyles as part of their belief system. And if we go to look at some other parts of the profile, we can see that suburban and rural families have a lower tendency to have concern about environmental and social programs, but they really do have more of a concern about the governance aspects, to the extent that they are thinking about these issues. And then it's really important, if you take that kind of learning and understand what makes a difference for you and your business. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples. Just want to make a clear upfront disclaimer, and these are not data from anybody that we do business with. The kind of data that I'm going to show in the examples are to show really digging deeper on the devil in the details, that there's different value systems and different ways of connecting with different people according to different brands. But we take data from large sample surveys that we do with Ipsos or with Vividata or Numeris, and some of them have actual information about brands. So this is an example for a large retailer that a lot of people would be familiar with, and I'm just not naming them because it's not really relevant, but it's also not coming from their own data. It's coming from data that we have through our relationship with survey partners. And what we do is, from that same view of, can we use all the different data sources that we have to understand from a brand perspective. And we could do this, we could do this for a government, we could do it for a not-for-profit, you could do it yourself with, mashing up different kinds of data that are available. We really want to understand, is there a way to help an organization develop an ESG strategy that's really not only compatible with their own values, but compatible with the people they serve. So we look at a selection of psychographic variables and align them to our social values. And then we actually work with organizations to make sure that what the data are showing is consistent, because all the data work that we all do is really an attempt to simulate reality, and we want to do a kind of a reality test. And then after we can actually summarize the impact of the psychographics and the values, then we can go even further and look at it by region, or if it's a retailer in this case, we can look at it in different localities and so on. But there's you take the data, and then you have to, I always remind people, you have to ask yourself the right business questions, and when you start to really work through the data. And in this case, we found from looking at it through this lens that this particular large retailer had a couple of really different groups in their customer base. Group that we ended up bringing together and calling family life versus younger years. And if you look at this grid, it's a bit of an eye chart, but we looked at environmental, social, and governance belief systems. And red is hot, blue is not. So the squares that have a high index are red. And so for the family life group, you can see that there are a number of issues that they feel very strongly about on the social aspect of ESG, but not so much on environmental and governance. And in the younger years, you have some subgroups that really rank high on some very specific aspects to environmental concerns versus social concerns, and not so much at all on the governance scale. So to me, that's a really important learning for people to have when they start to think about a strategy. And when I take some of those things and put them again on a simple chart where the X and Y axis are kind of average, we can see that on ecological concern, the family life is below the younger years. And on on two different values. This one is the ecological concern in general, and then this is attraction to nature. The family life is a little bit less behind average. So we can get really specific about how these values might affect things that you might do in advertising and in communication. Similarly, on community involvement and multiculturalism. So it's also got to do a little bit with what my belief system is versus what is my willingness to commit. Again, we can see the family life group ranking higher than the younger years, and both groups being above average for holding both of those values. And then this is another example of confidence in small business and rejection of authority. So the family life is below average in confidence in small business, and above average in rejection of authority. And the younger years, close to average on confidence in small business, but much further out in rejection of authority. All would be very important aspects to how you would want to communicate with them. And then a similar example, taking a bank, creating a couple of groups. and seeing, where you have, in this case, we looked at diversity. So high diversity versus low diversity across a bank's customers. Obviously, banks have customers from almost right across the spectrum, but a lot less pronounced index values. So a lot more kind of homogeneous, but still the more diverse segment having a lot more high indexes around social issues and not so much around governance, where the low diversity group on social and governance and not so much on environment. So I want to, and I can show you some of those separate ones, but I want to stop there because I wanted to make sure there's time for questions. What the main point that I want to make today is that when you're looking as an organization, and if you're the data person inside that organization, it's your responsibility to really find ways to find data and manipulate data so that you can help your organization be data driven in developing its policies. I mean, we're all used to using data for, product and marketing and branding and site location. But if I just recap here, we took a whole lot of different data to build Prism. We used a geodemographic method to link a very advanced spatial clustering process to a high quality survey. Then we took that actually got at psychographics. Then we looked at the psychographic variables from the point of view of those different population segments. And then we looked at the possible opportunity for two completely different kinds of organizations, a retailer and a bank, to be able to help form its ESG strategy and also use what the findings were from that ESG strategy to decide how to communicate their values to different people based on what would resonate within their customer base. So I am going to stop there and go back to Arthur to see if he has some questions for me.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much, Jen. That was great. Nice example. We do actually have some questions, so prepare for an influx here. So the first question is, what do you see as the biggest location data gap? You talked very early in the presentation about gaps in the data. Is there one particularly in respect of climate change, but is there one particular gap that you could point to and say, you know what, if we had that particular piece of data, that would make an immense difference to what we can predict and how we can guide the various organizations?
Well, I think, there's a lot of, like we work on the people side. So there's a lot of problems in measurement and infrastructure around energy and energy utility and the flows. And in Canada, there's not been the focus and the government leadership around what kind of data we need to measure conservation and to measure energy use. I know a lot of organizations are working on that. I'm not an expert, but I know when I consult with people about data that are needed to help people understand whether we're really, as we're now going to move forward with regulations and objectives, how are we going to make sure that we know if Canadian businesses are really complying? There's a big gap in the kind of infrastructure issues in the energy sector. Apart from that, though, I think one of the other challenges is that we still need, there's a lot of data. What we need is information. And so what I appeal to everybody on the call to think more about as not to think about, we love data. So we all of us who would be in a conference like this, always thinking about the next cool thing we can do. So let's, if we really want to support the climate change movement and the implementation of ESG for Canada, let's continue more dialogue about what is the problem we're trying to solve and what kinds of things could we actually produce from the data world that you can go and make actionable. because we can't boil the ocean and we have a limited period of time. So we need to think about what are the things, if I understand things that we want people to put into practice, then how can we provide data to show how far behind we are and whether or not we're making progress?
Yeah, where to apply the lever. Yeah, brilliant. Now, there was a graph that you showed with ecological concern versus multiculturalism. So that sort of provoked in my mind a question about ESG as a theme in not just in the clusters, but as a theme spatially. So, in other words, have you seen across Canada an uneven distribution of ESG awareness or ESG concerns? For example, Vancouver's been beaten up pretty thoroughly in the last year or so. Are you actually picking up on concerns in Vancouver that are disproportionately larger than concerns in Toronto, for example?
Well, there's a tremendous amount of geographic diversity, and what I always remind people that when you look at everything in the aggregate, you're always getting a blended, more average point of view. So the work that we see and when we work with others, you can kind of validate the things that you'd read in the newspaper, Ontario versus Alberta or Vancouver versus, Calgary, those kinds of general perceptions about the differences. But what I find fascinating is when we look at it by segment, we can also drive it right down into the neighborhood level. And with the psychographics, we tend maybe not to go all the way down at neighborhood postal codes, but maybe at the FSA level within cities, how do we see differences and how do we see those change year over year? I think the key thing is that Canada's such a diverse country. It's getting younger. We're still bringing in 300,000 to 400,000 immigrants a year. Where those immigrants come from, the real important thing about the data is that you can get below the trends, the aggregate of a Vancouver, and you can look at the neighborhoods of Vancouver and the comparison of, the census tracts, or you could look at the municipality level across different countries. So yes, we do see differences. Many of the differences on a number of issues are driven by cultural diversity. So it's not just attitudes on diversity that are driven by cultural diversity, but just remind everyone in terms of location analytics that it's really important to get to the granularity, because once you add it up to the market level, then you're really getting a lot more of a blended result.
Nice. Got a question here about the general public understanding location. So what are we missing in helping the general public to understand location intelligence and to set it up as a foundational understanding, I think, is what's meant here.
I can talk about this as a little bit from, the very controversial issue, which is, should we be allowed to use people's locations from their phones as a way of making data-driven decisions? So, and I want to say, number one, I'm 100% in favor of using people's locations to help with all kinds of decisions. And I'm a very strong advocate for making sure there's no contradiction between the trust that Canadians and others make with governments and brands and telecom providers when they allow us to track location on their phone. So I know that wasn't the exact question, but I believe that we've had some controversy around, is that okay? So number one, with full transparency, and I think what's really important is to explain to people why location matters so much. Matters in terms of, as I said before, the kind of the convenience in their lives as well as their well-being. I think a lot of people understand that location data, not only where I live, but where I go and where I shop, are really important for schools and healthcare and planning roads and commuter and public transit. Also important that if I run into my grocery store, and I want to make sure that it's kind of suited to my lifestyle in terms of the amount of time that's around the edges versus the middle. So I think location is so important, but what we haven't had is a good public discussion about what's positive about privacy compliant, 100% transparent use of location data to help make people's lives better. And that when you're in the face of a lot of opposition and sort of a lot of a populist sentiment that anything like this is bad, I think it's incumbent on the data community to, number one, totally assure that ethical brands and reliable information companies and telecoms that are responsible and regulated must take care of data and use data in a responsible way. But the second half of that equation is if we don't use location data for all those kinds of planning purposes, then Canada, as not only a viable economic force, but also as a civil society and a healthy society coming out of COVID, for example, is going to suffer. So we all need to be champions for location data to be available for responsible, ethical analysis and remind Canadians who might get caught up in this thing, well, what are they using my data for? Perfectly legitimate question. I don't think the data community talks about it enough.
I think it's so if I can contribute a little bit here, I've always thought of it as a fear thing. So if you're actually if you actually have some understandings of what location intelligence is capable of and how it can help society and yourself as an individual, if you have that understanding, then your likelihood to permit the sharing of the information is much higher. I think it's fundamentally people going, oh, they know where I was. What can they do with that? Instead of saying they know where I was, and if they'd been really smart, they would have told me to buy eggs before I left the grocery store. Right? It's
actually showing that it makes people's lives better. But I think it's also important to emphasize that we can do a lot of good work with these data by using anonymous, de-identified data, by ensuring that that the data that can be fed into the kind of models and analysis that we're doing should ensure that there's no possibility of re-identification. So I think people will feel more comfortable when they understand the use cases better. But I also don't think that we're losing a lot as a data and analytics industry by looking at ways to ensure that those data make lives better, but also protect the privacy of Canadians and make sure that we're transparent about that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Jan, I think we've got time for one more question. This one's a simple one, but a bit twisted. Are we making a mistake in bundling environmental, social, and governance? We always have ESG as the 3-letter acronym. Are we making a mistake in bundling those, thinking of this as a statistician and a mathematician?
Well, what I'm really trying to say is, depending on who you are, if you're a bank or a retailer, you better know what your users or the people you're serving care about, because some people care more about the E or the S or the G, and you need to align to that. And I think those 3 letters talk about the important social issues, but it's not the same for everyone. And if a business says, oh yeah, well, we got an E and an S and a G, it seems to me they're probably less likely to be doing a deep dive and understanding it. So I don't have a problem with it as a kind of a concept, because what we're doing is we're holding ourselves as a society to a higher accountability and a standard. But that's where I think the data need to help organizations go deeper and understand what's important for them as the individuals that run an organization, but also, are we in tune with our customers or not? And then for me, it's unlikely that you're going to have your all 3 in every program.
Perfect. Well, Jan, it's absolutely been a pleasure. I have to shut it down here, but thanks so much for coming on, spending some time getting us a little bit more educated here, and absolutely appreciate it. Thanks.
The pleasure is entirely mine. I love talking with people who understand data and want to do good things with it. So thanks to everybody for joining.
All righty. Thank you all.